Let's take a look at a case study of the various flatteners at work. We'll use Amazon.com, a company which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. But let's take a look first at the traditional book retailer and the business model that occurs with a traditional bookseller in a brick and mortar environment. So day zero, a book enters the inventory. 90 days later, the supplier of that book, the publisher, actually gets paid by that book retailer. On average, on day 167, a customer will purchase that book, and payment is received by the book retailer on day 168, 78 days after the supplier has been paid. So you can see that this requires an investment up front into the inventory, and actually this is called, the accountants call this working capital. No need to remember that term. But with Amazon and taking advantage of several of the flatteners, and let's see if you can spot some of them. But let's describe what happens at Amazon. So day zero, book enters the inventory. Day 16, the customer purchases the book on average. On day 17, Amazon receives payment. At day 58, Amazon pays the publisher. So cash in this particular case is received 41 days before payment. So there isn't actually a requirement on Amazon's part to actually fund the inventory. What flatteners are at work? First of all, the whole notion of supply chain management is at work here. Because of the information that Amazon is able to collect through its processes, it understands which books customers have a demand for and are able to purchase those books in advance of the customer demand to some extent. And in fact, it only takes about 16 days before the customers actually buys the books that Amazon contracts for. Now, what's interesting is that's if we're talking about a hardbound book. With the advent of the Kindle, we are now talking about electronic books. And in fact, there is no inventory, if you will, which even compresses this cycle even more so. So we have, with respect to the overall process, we have workflow at work here. And the other thing that is at work is, in fact, one of the steroids, and that is the Kindle and the advent of electronic books. Now, the other thing that is at work here is that you can buy a book from Amazon anywhere in the world. So certainly the whole notion of actually the web, the internet, enabling this whole process, which is the second flatteners, is actually what allowed Amazon to come into existence in the first place. Not only that, you can buy books regardless of where you are in the world, whether you are in China, India, United States, anywhere in Europe. The other thing that you don't know or you can't see just by this process, the fact that UPS is partnering with Amazon, it becomes their shipper and is able to be part of that insourcing model as well. So several of the flatteners are at work. We mentioned supply chain, we mentioned 8995, we mentioned the steroids. The other thing is the whole workflow that Amazon is also at play here. Its website is a workflow engine. This flat world has several benefits and risks associated with it. One of the benefits is the exponential growth in opportunities, the long tail, which we'll talk about. The other thing is the rise of social networks. Social networking is allowed to connect people together and actually allow to bridge both time and distance. I'm not a big user of Facebook, but I have actually been able to use Facebook and LinkedIn to connect with friends that I've kind of lost touch with, as well as business colleagues to reach out and on LinkedIn and reach out and connect with them as well. But probably the most compelling personal story I can relate to is that I grew up in a large extended family in Toledo, Ohio, with my grandmother had in the neighborhood of 30 grandchildren. I was one of 30 grandchildren, so I had a lot of cousins, and we all grew up essentially close together in the same neighborhood. And as we got older, we grew up, had our families, many of us moved away. And I've lost touch with many of them, and except for with the advent of Facebook, I had one cousin who, once I signed up on Facebook, discovered me. And through her and through Facebook, I was able to connect with this extended family that I've grown up with and lost touch with. So cousins and uncles and that sort of thing, I was able to use social networks to connect with. The other thing that it does is democratized information. Before, information was available to only those folks that had access to it, and usually that was dictated by what your economic standing was, how much education you had, and how much education you can afford. Now, if you have an internet connection, you have access to an abundance of information, and some would say much too much information, but we're essentially hyper-connected with what's going on in the world, and we can satisfy any of our curiosities that we possibly might have. And we can also actually create informational services and informational products and distribute those at little or no cost. Some of the risks is that the flat world is unpredictable. Things can happen at the speed of light and introduces a level of unpredictability into the mix. And we'll talk a little bit about this in week 5 with respect to security, but we are so dependent upon the internet that things like viruses can disrupt commerce, things like hacking of information and getting into bank accounts. And the other thing that it does is that for all the good that we can do with this flat interconnected world, the bad guys can be interconnected as well. And so we've seen a rise in global terror networks that have become globalized as well, that have arisen because of the same connectivity that we all can benefit for good. And then, of course, it creates bubbles. Information traveling quickly can create distortions in the normal economic flow of things. Where things happen slowly, one might be able to dampen the effect, but we've seen where stock markets have fluctuated wildly because of misinformation and sometimes even because of a technical glitch. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is the notion of the long tail. This is a great article that I reference here with respect to the long tail, which was written by Chris Anderson. He actually wrote a book about this, but there's also an article in Wired magazine. What happened, there was a time where media companies, books, music, TV, movies, etc., they made money from a small number of hits. Same goes for just about any business. What the technology has wrought for the media industry is the ability to create a business on not just selling hits. That's because the carrying cost of inventory basically goes to zero, as also the cost of shipping. So these sorts of things, books, music, TV, shows, movies, can all exist in a digital format. So there is very little, if any, well, there's no production cost except for the cost of producing. So you can appeal to a broader, more global market. Let's probably best way to explain this is by an example. Let's say you specialize in bagpipe music. You're very interested in bagpipe music. If you open a typical bricks and mortar store anywhere outside of Scotland, you can only appeal to a small number of customers. And you'd have to carry an inventory just like the traditional bookseller. But online, you don't have to carry inventory. You can just make digital downloads available to your customers. And not only that, the number of prospective customers in the bricks and mortar situation is limited to a given geographical region. Now you have access to bagpipe music fans anywhere in the world. Internet, you could only survive dealing with the head of this curve. Now you can sustain a business, a profitable business, at the tail end. And this concept opens up a lot of commercial and economic opportunities. Now, one of the things we want to talk about is the problem with trends. And that is the concept of the Black Swan, which was popularized by a book by the same name by Nazim Taleb. Now, he wrote a book titled The Black Swans, and we all know swans are white. The Black Swan is not only unexpected, but is actually improbable. But the fact is that every now and then, a black swan is born defying the odds. The characteristics of a black swan event is that, as Taleb has described is that they are in fact unpredictable, they are massive in impact, and after the fact we concoct an explanation that makes the event seem less random. 9/11 was a Black Swan event. The Arab Spring was a Black Swan event. Google, Facebook are Black Swans. What happened is that they happened and they in fact disrupted the trend. Some Black Swans are good and some are bad. And even though you can't know a specific Black Swan will happen, you can know that Black Swans will occur. Robustness in your operation is your only safeguard against Black Swans. And what I mean by robustness are things like savings accounts and insurance policies, redundancy in networks, backing up your data, contingency plans, and developing your skills and knowledge. We'll talk more about this when we discuss managing uncertainty and risk. The point here is that analyzing trends is difficult but necessary. So you have to understand both the historical context and be able to describe and understand the various forces that are at work, whether they are external to you or internal, which are the decisions we make. You have to be able to understand the inflection point, when those drivers and restrainers come together to actually change the trend, and understand what those combinations of forces that will come together to affect a change, and when those forces will come together, and then to be able to develop an appropriate course of action, such as contingency plans, and understand the consequential results. Now, a consequential result is the unexpected or bad thing that you want to avoid by getting the results that you're looking for. For example, you might want to be able to make a product more cheaply. One of the ways to do that is to use materials of lesser quality. That might not be what you're looking for. You want to find a way to make a product more cheaply, but not compromise on the quality. You want to be able to, in fact, make things faster or deliver on a product or a service faster or complete a project faster, but the consequential result that you hopefully want to avoid is not to increase costs.